Thank you.
So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen who are here joining us in Sharm el Sheikh. We are moving on to our next session, our next fabulous panel. I'm so delighted to welcome our friends. They feel like family, really, from One Young World, who've worked with us again this year in bringing together some of these fabulous voices to hear. And so without further ado, I am going to introduce to you guys an extraordinary panel, which is all about innovative climate change solutions and achieving net zero. Take it away.
Hello. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. So here to discuss a very important topic, climate change, and what's one of the major barriers in order to achieve net zero. So we have a very diverse panel here from different sectors. Let me introduce myself first. My name is Jason Salgado. I'm a youth climate leader from Belize and a master candidate in climate change and international development. And also I'm a social entrepreneur working with climate finance and carbon markets. So here we have Felipe and Vilea from Renature. We have Andrew Griffin from Planet Mark, and we have Anna Stanley from World Business Council for Sustainable Development. So we will discuss a little bit about your work. What do you do? So please introduce yourself. Tell what you do within your organization. Thank you.
I guess I'll go first then. Yeah, thank you guys. So I'm Anna Stanley Regia. I'm a director for climate transparency at WBCSD, and I co-lead the climate work at WBCSD. For those of you who don't know WBCSD, maybe it's a big NGO working together with lots of different corporates to move towards a more sustainable world on topics across climate, nature, and equity. And I co-lead the climate work in that space, focused really on creating more transparency on environmental impact, especially in the space of carbon, but also in other areas, and bringing together not just businesses, but policymakers, governments, disclosure organizations, standard-setting bodies, all sorts of different parts of life, sort of, to resolve some of these challenges. So thank you so much for having me here today, and great to be here with a very great panel. Very much looking forward to it.
So my name's Andrew. I'm from Planet Mark in the UK, and we certify organisations for carbon reduction and the creation of social value, including Extreme, who are hosting us here today. Woo woo! Love Extreme. They're brilliant. So we support organisations on their net zero journey. We have over 600 members and growing, from very small sort of toy shops on Sheffield High Street through to sort of charities like the Eden Project and much larger entities like Volvo and Fortnum & Mason, for example. So excited to be here. Should be a really interesting discussion.
So hello everybody, pleasure to be here with all of you guys. I'm Felipe, I'm from Brazil. I'm the co-founder of Renature. It's a Dutch organization working on supporting farmers and corporates in the transition from conventional to regenerative agriculture practices. I come from an agroforestry background and family farming focused on citrus, so I have been always passionate about nature-inclusive agriculture. And since I saw the massive deforestation in the Amazon, mainly due to commodity production, I started realizing that we need to really start including nature and forest into agriculture. That's how I got involved into agroforestry and regenerative agriculture. I saw the massive potential, and I look forward to this discussion where we can really exchange, learn, and see that nature is inspiring us to produce not just our food, but also our textiles, our cosmetics, and so forth, so we can regenerate while producing our needs. So thank you so much, and I look forward to it.
Okay. So thank you so much for the introduction. So in order to set the stage, so within net zero, there are many misconceptions. So there's many people cannot differentiate what is between climate neutrality and net zero. So that's why. Can you guys explain a little bit more about why people have this misconception, and what is the difference between neutrality and net zero? Can you start, please?
Yeah, sure. I think it's important to realize the difference between net zero and neutralizing emissions. But one thing that's stepping a bit away from it is like realizing that just becoming carbon neutral is not enough. I think we need to go beyond carbon neutrality and beyond net zero. I think we can go towards net positive and really maximize our impact rather than just neutralizing our impact. And that's what regeneration is all about as well. It's about going beyond sustainability. It's about going beyond carbon neutrality, so we can really become carbon positive and have a net zero economy and so forth. So I think if you look at most of organizations that are trying to build labels around net zero commitments, you see that they're trying to offset their emissions in projects which is not directly related to their supply chains. Working with the fashion company, they come to us asking, can we plant trees in the Amazon to offset our emissions? So when you ask them, where is your cotton coming from? They have no clue. So we should start looking at insetting programs as well, so we can offset the emissions inside corporate supply chains, so that we can go beyond this, carbon neutrality, very simplistic way to put labels, so that we can really use this capital more intelligently and more efficient inside supply chains. So that's I just wanted to contribute to this question relating to the carbon insetting that I see that it's a very huge contribution.
Sure, and just to build on what Felipe said, I think moving toward regeneration and getting to net positive that's the end goal. Is that net zero is really about not doing harm. And it feels like a very low bar for us to set, right? It's like, I just want to not do bad things. We'll start there, and then we work towards regeneration and net positive. But to very briefly give, I guess, the more technical definition, so that we know what we're talking about. When we say net zero, what we mean is your emissions across all three scopes of measurement, which includes your whole value chain, both how your products are used after they leave you and how you've sourced them from suppliers, etc., etc. So 90% reduction from a baseline. And only up to that last 10% is what you are allowed to use carbon removal offsets for, because that's what's seen as your unavoidable residual emissions. Now, these standards are going to get continually updated, and there are some challenges and there are some gaps within it, but what makes it different to carbon neutral is that carbon neutral doesn't necessarily require any set reduction targets, and it doesn't necessarily require you to be measuring all of your scopes of emission. So you can pay your way out of trouble today, and if I came to you and I said, I am the most sustainable person in the world, and then you found out that the only things I had measured was my energy bills and my car if I owned one, that's my scopes 1 and 2, and I'd left out the food I eat, the products I buy, the places I travel by other means, you might not think I'd necessarily done enough to justify my statement, right? And that's the same principle for organizations. They have to be measuring the full scope of what they're causing and doing, and they have to be focusing on reduction, not simply buying offsets.
I think that was very nicely said by both of you, so I'm not sure I've got much to add to this question.
Nice. So Andrew, Felipe, you made a very valid point, because there's a difference. And for example, with the carbon offsetting we just mentioned, carbon market is one of the tools that most of the companies use in order to offset their emission, and somehow there is the debate regarding greenwashing. So it has to do with, let's use the tool, but let's not abuse, let's not use it to the extreme. So that's why these companies need to be taken accountable about all the internal operational accountability that is, in order to change to net zero. So that's take to my other question. Accountability is very important concept in order to to push for this all different sectors in order to take climate action. So and young people also play a very important role in being accountable. So we need stronger reforms in order for to set the stage, set the framework. So that leads to my question: how can young people be involved in order to push these frameworks in order to have this different sector accountable in regards to net zero?
Maybe before we sort of get onto that question, I wanted to sort of take one step back in response to one of the things you said. You know, it's all fair and square to say let's sort of move towards net zero, but currently a lot of big corporates, a lot of organizations out there don't even know what their footprint actually is. We really have a massive data problem. So actually being able to understand your environmental impact to then act upon it, I think is something that really needs to change. And it's sort of something that people don't really think about. They're like, oh yeah, there's a commitment out there. Companies are talking about sort of the reduction journey they're going to go on. But the matter of fact is, a lot of data that's being used is modeled data. It's very sophisticated data, but it's not primary data. So, it's not sort of the impact that your water bottle has, but it's the impact of sort of all the corporations in the value chain sort of pulled together. So it's a very high, overarching, some clever person sitting somewhere thinking about what the impact is, but corporation by corporation, and then it's sort of divided up again and said that water bottle has this impact. So I wanted to sort of say that because I think it's important when you talk about accountability. It's really important to understand at the moment we're not at a space where you can actually create accountability because we don't have the data baseline. That said, and coming to your question around sort of how can young people contribute towards this, I think the first thing is to sort of ask, what is the impact? What is the impact of my product? What is the impact of my purchase decision? Tell me how much carbon or how much biodiversity and sort of other environmental factors. What's the impact this is creating? I think that's one sort of it's maybe a small step, but I think that's sort of one first space where consumers definitely can shift shift corporates to be more or to want to show how they are more accountable and to kind of create more transparency.
Just to build on what Anna said there, you'll hear it said a lot. You can't manage what you don't measure, and you can't progress towards something that you haven't set a target for. And it sounds very sort of basic, but if you imagine your chief financial officer coming to you and saying, "I need you to save money, need you to cut money from the budget, and I don't want you to measure anything. I don't want you to set any targets or do anything like that. I just want you to come up with a list of things that you think will reduce the amount of money we spend, and then our investors are going to be really pleased with that list, and they're going to be really happy that we gave them that wonderful list." No, we won't know whether we succeeded. We'll have no evidence for return on investment, payback. We won't know what happened. Did it work? What worked better than others? So you really have to have that measurement in place. But I guess to turn to the question that you asked there, the first thing for me, so I chair there's an organisation in the UK called the Institute of Directors, who represent sort of 20,000 directors across the UK, and I chair the National Sustainability Task Force there. So I get to have a lot of conversations with sort of large corporate CEOs, and I have lost count of the number of times I've heard a large corporate CEO say that they were changing their sustainability strategy in a very significant way, and one of the primary drivers of that was the fact that it had been fed all the way up the comms chain that a number of students, grad students, had been asking questions about the organization's sustainability credentials inside of their interview. That is someone who does not work for the company, might never work for the company, they might not have got the job, influencing board level strategy because they asked a question. It really is as simple as that. So ask questions, seek answers. If you have ideas and you have solutions, propose them. If you're in a place where that's not welcomed and accepted, you might be in the wrong place. But keep doing it, because eventually if enough people do it, they will move. And it's the same answer for how small businesses can influence their suppliers, where they often feel that they don't have power. Just ask questions. Just ask, do you have your carbon footprint? They might say no, but they might say yes. And if they say no, and another one of their customers asks, and another one of their customers asks, and so on and so forth, we start to see the change that we need.
Perfect. Yeah. So adding to what has been said already, which is very rich, I can give some examples on how the young people, at least in Brazil, are taking action towards a more regenerative and more net zero economy. For instance, in farming, because I come from an agriculture background, so that's where I'm mostly experienced. And you see the next generation of farmers realizing the harm that their parents and grandparents have done to their environment. We have today 1/3 of our planets already is degraded due to agriculture, conventional agriculture practices, mining and logging activities. So now young people, they're really realizing that they can change landscapes and land use in a more efficient and sustainable way. By using regenerative and agroforestry practices, we're seeing a huge trend of young people moving from urban environments to go back to rural areas so that we can produce the food for the coming generations. We have a huge risk of food insecurity ahead of us because of all the climate impacts we have in agriculture. Last year, we had 30% yield decrease in coffee in Brazil because of intensive frost. And coffee, Brazil is the biggest exporter of coffee in the world. And not just like put that into coffee, but then putting that in other crops across the globe. We're seeing the impacts of climate change in agriculture, and how can we ensure food security. So I think the young people, they have a major role to play to bring innovative solutions in farming so we can really make sure that we can provide enough food for the coming generations. And I think we as people who are working in the climate change mitigation, we can really embrace these innovations from young people and connect to the land and really make sure we can have a food secure world ahead of us.
And maybe just to add, we were having sort of a conversation just before we came onto stage to sort of, think what you're good at. You don't have to be me or, one of the other people on the panel. Everyone's journey is an individual journey, and you have specific strengths which will make you good at one specific space. That doesn't have to be in the corporate environment. That doesn't have to be in the startup environment. And it's also just the small everyday things that you do. So I was giving the example, a couple of years ago, I stopped eating meat and, started sort of more and more eating vegan food as much as I could. And, people were saying, well, but what's the impact? You're just one sort of person doing this. It's not going to change the world just because you don't eat meat. But now when I go to people and they cook for me, for example, they will not make meat. So that's one meal less with sort of one meal more without meat. And so sort of it's a snowball effect of those small actions you take. So I really would encourage you to think about what you're good at, sort of where you can bring your skills the best in this general movement. And even if it's small, no single thing you're doing is too small to have a change. So I think that's really one thing I really want to highlight, because I think sometimes you feel overwhelmed by this sort of, what can I do? I'm just one little person. But you aren't. You're part of, something much bigger.
Yeah, in sustainability, yes, we need sustainability analysts and carbon analysts, but we also need operations people, we need comms people, we need artists, we need musicians, we need, you name an industry, you name a speciality, psychologists, we need a lot of psychologists. It's a scary world out there. And we need everyone. So as Anna was saying, find something you're good at, that you're passionate about, and focus on how can you make a difference using that skill set. Yes, you can play a role as a protester, but that's not going to be right for everyone. I often sort of get that sort of thing of, should I be out there chaining myself to things and things like that, but I might not get to have the conversations I have in the boardrooms if I was doing that. And so for my skill set, I feel I can try and sort of, I'm a 30-year-old guy who wants to come in and I'm often invited in as the token millennial to come in with a board meeting of much older people. And if I can sort of try and represent our views and things like that in that environment, for me, that's where I've found I fit best. But that will be different for each person. So there's really a world of possibility for how people can make a difference.
So thank you so much. Yeah, so very important point. Everyone has an important role to play in order to achieve net zero. Every little action counts. So we have these big ambitions, right? Net zero by the year 2050. That's a very complicated, because we need different resources. We need the collaboration of different sectors, including the innovation technology sector. And there is this debate, or this, let's say this point that many people, or many, at least the private sector say, okay, so how can we transition? What are the resources? We don't have all the resources. For example, finance is one of them, and the other is one very important is technology. We don't have the technology. We can access the technology. So that's accessing technology. Even some of these technologies aren't available today. So one of our plans is that the technologies are not here, but will be there someday, and when they are available, then we will use them to transition. But nobody knows what's the time frame, and that can take different consequences. That can take our ambition backwards. So, just want to ask, what are the consequences of having this long-term ambition and not having short-term solutions, more specifically technological solutions?
I think we need to stop making excuses. I think the sort of, we can't do it today, it'll take time, it's expensive. I think the COVID crisis has shown us if we want to mobilize, we can mobilize everything very, very quickly. And I think I feel like we're getting to a tipping point. I don't think we're there yet, but we're getting to a tipping point. And maybe it's too late, but we're getting to the tipping point where everyone's sort of realizing we have to really speed up what we're doing. So I think that's the first thing I'd like to say. We really need to stop making excuses and say it's not possible. And I think that some of the technologies are already there. I guess it depends on whose book you read or who you follow. But there are many people who say we have the technologies, we don't have the finance that's being put into them. And again, it's really stop making excuses. The finance people say, well, we have money, we don't have the projects. All of the projects on the ground say we have the projects, we don't have the money. And I think the way to and the way to sort of overcome that in a way, in my view, is really to, and this is meant to be the implementation COP. We need to stop talking and actually just doing. And the way you do that, in my opinion, is to bring together different organizations from different countries, different focuses, public sector, private sector, small organizations, large organizations, incumbents, new organizations, in different settings, exactly like what we're doing here today, where you sort of have the ocean in the background. I think there was meditation and snorkeling and swimming this morning, sort of appealing also to not just the mind, but also the heart. And, I think we need to stop making excuses and just get it done.
I would wholeheartedly agree with that. On a personal level, I believe we kind of have all of the solutions we need, and it's now a communications challenge more than anything. We have to face up to the fact that the majority of people in the majority of places on the planet are currently living a sustainable lifestyle. Right? That's the reality. This isn't a thing where we've been living unsustainably for the entirety of the human species. This has happened pretty much since 1970 was when the hockey stick happened of energy emissions and all of these things. Which means it's my grandparents, it's my parents, and it's me. 3 generations who have overseen what has happened to our planet and not, let's be clear here. The planet's going to be fine. This isn't a summit where we're trying to save the planet. The planet's going to be fine. Nature will continue to exist even if the human species doesn't. What's at risk here is the human species and a lot of other species with it. And we have to start thinking of ourselves as very much part of that ecosystem rather than somehow separate to it. And embracing the solutions that are out there at the pace and at the level of urgency that we claim to be having. This is not a time to, rest on our laurels and be like, oh yes, we're doing enough. It's got to be more, and that's why. So with Planet Mark from 2013 onwards, our approach has always been measure progress. We're not here to rubber stamp and say, yes, this is your carbon footprint. Off you go for another year. In order to recertify each year, you must be reducing your carbon emissions. That's the only metric we care about. You've got to be reducing those carbon emissions year on year. And fortunately, we've got over 600 companies in our membership, and they're a sign that's where I get my biggest hope from, really, is across our members, pre-COVID, 2019, they reduced their absolute emissions year on year by 12% on average. According to sort of World Economic Forum and various analyses, what we need to be doing globally is an average of like a 7.5% reduction per year if we're starting from like now. So lots of organizations are finding they can reduce their emissions. They can do this. And if everyone does that, there's a size and there's a scale issue here. If everyone does that, we genuinely can do it. It's possible. But we have to make it so.
Yeah, I totally follow, and I believe that we already have some of the technologies, and we are already seeing a shift. But the question is the speed, right? So how fast regeneration is going compared to degeneration? We have a very distant gap there, and in order for us to speed it up, we need to find ways that we can really scale regeneration practices. And in order to get there, I think there's 3 major challenges. One is like mindset shift, which is, most people are disconnected from their food. People don't know where their food is coming from, and that really relates distance with the food, but also with nature, with the land, because I think we have the ancient knowledge from indigenous people that comes from these landscapes that is abundant, and they have been living for more than 5,000, for more than 1,000 years in this in rainforests and in ecosystems where they have grown their own food, medicine, and so forth. So I think we need to learn from nature and the indigenous communities on how to preserve the natural environment and really connect ourselves to this new mindset of regenerative. And secondly is also technologies, but also like mechanization. I'm talking more about the agriculture, of course, now, but if we look at ways we can measure, but also scale more regenerative practices, the only way to do that is using mechanization that is not existing right now, because after the Second World War, with the Green Revolution, we start building machineries that only fits conventional agricultural practices. If we want to use cover crops, no tillage, diversify our crops, we need new machineries and technologies to allow us to scale that. And then the third and last one is really on transition finance. So how can we enable blended finance, financial instruments, so farmers can have access to capital to really transition their systems, but also scale. So how can we build financial instruments to enable farmers to go through this transition period? Because it is a large investment in the beginning, but nobody is actually supporting them. And the smallholder farmers are the most pressured ones. So I think the transition. I know I brought to the agricultural part, but I think that's where I'm mostly involved. So I just think this kind of 3 elements it builds up the potential for us to transition and scale and really come to a more resilient future.
And I'm glad you brought up that point on the financing, because I think it comes back to a little bit also what you were saying, Andrew. It's also a question of comms and of communication. We need to stop talking just about the fact that there's a climate crisis, there's urgency. Yes, I think it is the case. But I think for corporates, it still is a lot about the financial opportunity or the financial risk. And so I think that's one way how you can sort of get that world to shift, is by highlighting, if you look long term, also you look at the sort of risk that companies are facing in their supply chains, for the producers, in the agricultural space, for example, the risk of not doing anything is actually incredibly big. And it's a financial conversation to be had. And that's something that corporates at least understand quite well, is, financial opportunity, tick. So I think we sort of need to change the narrative as well, not just about the crisis, but also sort of move towards thinking about, the financial, the economics, exactly. So that's why I think the point on the, it's maybe slightly different, but I think the financing part is a very important point.
Exactly. Like I think, as you mentioned, the cost of inaction is much bigger than the cost of action, right? So if we are quantifying the impacts, the economic impact of our inaction in different sectors, there will be a tremendous impact on nature. And that's why I really like the agenda of true cost accounting, where we can really quantify the environmental and social impacts and start like really putting a price of these impacts on products, so that products that comes from deforested and conventional agricultural practices is much more expensive than regenerative products. So I think there's also a way to go that to move that in that direction, so that we poor and vulnerable people in the global south can have access to food that is sustainable and so forth. So just to adding a bit on the.
So great. So yeah. So there are many solutions. So there's lack of resources, right? There's lack of support of the solutions. So I want to ask Andrew. So you work with a lot of corporates, different from the private sector, over 600 you mentioned. What are some of the innovative solutions? What are the best example you think this corporate can
I mean, a lot of them aren't that sexy. We're not. A lot of it is really just doing sensible things, right? And a lot of it comes from measurement. So I'll give one really slightly funny example that our COO gives. He used to be sustainability manager for a very big sort of hotel chain, And he has a story which he tells, which is the most expensive hot dog in the world. And basically, they started getting energy data in 15-minute intervals from all of their different hotel sites. They put in that measurement capacity. And they realized that there was one particular kitchen that had a way higher energy consumption than the other kitchens. And in particular, that energy consumption was between 6 a.m. and 8 a.m. in the morning, before they had started serving. And so they went in, they chatted to the chef, they said, what's going on pre-serving? Like, why are we using so much energy at that time? And it turned out that the chef had a deal with the security guard, where instead of the chef having to come in 15 minutes early to turn on all the equipment, the security guard would turn on all of the equipment when he was doing his rounds in the morning when he came in at 6 a.m. He'd turn everything on so that the chef could get a 15-minute extra piece of time in bed. And in return, he would give that security guard a free hot dog every day to thank him for turning on the equipment for him. They worked out that that hot dog was costing the company £25,000 a year in energy bills, right? So through measuring and understanding what you're dealing with, you can absolutely find where you can save real money. I think I saw a report by Virgin and O2 where they did an assessment, and they found that for companies with more than 1,000 full-time employees, on average, there are £2.6 million worth of savings per year to be found through changing things within your energy and your transportation. 2.6 million. Can you imagine that as a sales opportunity? You'd be lauded as, oh, you brought in 2.6 million deal? That's amazing. This is a cost saving. There are costs of sale. There's always costs that come with selling stuff. There's no cost of saving. If you save that money, that goes directly to the bottom line. It helps the business. It makes it more resilient. And that's why companies who have a really strong sustainability credentials are now being consistently found to outperform and be more resilient than organizations who don't.
I guess maybe just to add, and I don't have a hot dog example. I think this is the first time somebody's spoken about a hot dog on a sustainability panel, but I hope it was a vegan hot dog. Kind of all joking aside, what I find very encouraging to see, and as I said, I work for an organization that works together with big businesses on a daily basis. We bring together over 200 leading companies in the world to work on projects together. And one of the things I find really, really encouraging to see is how much more collaboration there is. Collaboration, not just among corporates, but also with the supply chain. Understanding sort of where the challenges are that the suppliers are facing and how they can be supported in becoming better at in managing their own environmental footprint. And kind of very specifically, the work that I sort of lead focuses on environmental footprint, surprisingly, or the impact that kind of companies have in the production processes. And companies are starting to put in place systems and working together with their supply chains to put in place systems to share that environmental footprint data across the entire value chain. So, for example, for the hot dog, or whatever other product, I don't know, your shampoo, for example. Every player in that value chain that feeds a chemical in, that feeds electricity in, whatever it is, they're sharing their data across the value chain, and they're working together so that at the end you're able to put a sort of number on that shampoo, and we as consumers can go and say, I don't want that shampoo because it's so much higher on the footprint than that shampoo over there. So this sort of collaborative aspect and understanding how you also incentivize that behavior in the supply chain to be more transparent and to see opportunity in transparency. I think that's something that I'm seeing a lot more from big corporates, and it's really, really encouraging because I think, as you said, you can't measure, so you can't manage what you can't measure. So that's sort of the first stepping stone towards that.
Felipe? So great. So working with all these companies, so as you mentioned, you can manage what you can measure. So it's really an incentive for companies. From your experience, what's the change, from 10 years from now? How has corporates been moving? Do you see corporates moving towards net zero because based on incentive that are really internal operational incentive, in the context of business and and profitability?
I mean, maybe I'll yes and no. I think is the answer to that. I think there is more progress being made for sure. There's not enough progress being made, and we really need to. The progress is not fast enough. I think that's the other thing. We sort of touched upon it briefly earlier. There are a lot of unlocks which still need to happen, and we're sort of moving towards that. But it is encouraging that in many big corporates, for example, the sustainability function is no longer sort of an add-on comms piece. It now is, there's often a separate function which you can argue about whether that's a good idea or not, but it's starting to be embedded more and more. I was talking to someone yesterday, and they were sort of saying, it's in a way, it's like the digital revolution. 10, 20, 15, 20 years ago, when the sort of internet started, companies had to rethink how they operate. They had to bring digitization and digital capabilities across the entire organization. And I think that's what needs to happen with sustainability still, that in every single function, people understand what they're doing and why they're doing it, what the sustainability aspect is in it. But at least we're making progress compared to where we were before. And I think there is sort of a movement towards having more sustainability embedded, but it's still, a long way off to being where we need it to be.
Yeah, maybe just to share also like some examples, like we have been working with multiple corporates in the transition from to regenerative practices, also to Unilever, to Danone, to LVMH, and we see that we're building these programs to kick off and strategy, but I see a lot of these kind of commitments stays for a strategy for too long, and we need to move away from strategy to implementation and really drive scale there, because it does take a long time for agriculture practices to provide outcomes. I see also a lot of these corporates looking for existing labels for certifications that can communicate to consumers about their transition to regenerative, but we need to realize that regenerative agriculture is focused on outcomes, not really in practice. So we all looking for labels to kind of make sure that it's coming from a decent place. But the thing is, in the future, it will not matter which kind of taxonomy is behind the agriculture practices, if it's agroecology, agroforestry, regenerative, sustainable and carbon farming, because what's the outcomes for soil organic carbon? What's the outcome for increase in biodiversity? What's the women empowerment? So I think we need to look at outcomes and really see how can companies and the corporates can contribute to measure these outcomes and constantly report to consumers so they can have a transparent way to really the product, the added value, and so forth. So I think corporates have still a long way to go, and traceability is key, but also the transition is also as important. So we can really make a step ahead in so forth from corporates. We're talking about a project in Brazil. We're involved in agroforestry cocoa systems that has been sequestering 45 tons per hectare per year. 45 tons, like most farms sequester, up to 2 to 5 tons per hectare per year. So if you use diversified agroforestry system, we have a huge potential to bring that carbon back to soil, and I think soil is something we can really go beyond, include in our dialogues more to reach net zero. So anyway, of course, I'm again bringing soil agriculture, but I think it's because it's agriculture is part of the solution. Climate change and So
agriculture is a huge part of it. You don't need to apologize for leaning into your expertise. That's what we've talked about. We lean into what we're good at, right? And Felipe's spot on. I mean, you can't lie to nature, right? We have to be focused on outcomes, because you can do all the clever carbon accounting and but Mother Nature, I bought all these wonderful offsets. Nature doesn't care what clever little statistical mathematical tricks we play on ourselves. At the end of the day, there is an equation by which more is emitted or less is emitted, and more is sequestered or less is sequestered. That's the game we're playing when we're talking about specifically carbon emissions and climate change and global warming. Now we can get into biodiversity and all sorts of other issues and soil health, and you can go on for ages. But in terms of coming back to the question, are organizations moving to net zero? Are they able to do it? I would say yes. Not fast enough, yes, as well, but reaching a tipping point. There are a tipping point. There are climate tipping points, but there are also social tipping points, right? And we are reaching a tipping point where, particularly an economic tipping point, where the economic argument is rock solid. Renewable energy is now vastly cheaper than fossil fuel energy. Argument over. That's been very, very well demonstrated. And you've got the situations now where what used to be a 5 or 6 year payback period for a solar panel in the UK is now a 1 to 2 year payback period, which when I was chatting to one of our members who has a factory and they make brushes, he said that buying solar energy, buying sort of solar panels to put on their roof from when they first were doing it has gone from being already a really good investment to almost a business case in its own right. Like, it's almost their own business line. And that shift makes a huge difference, because when we come to the realization that fundamentally businesses make money by solving problems, the bigger the problem is, the more people that it affects, and the more complex the solutions are, the bigger the market opportunity, right? You name a bigger potential problem than the risk of human extinction. Can't be done. So there's a lot of opportunity here for those who are in every sector who are finding meaningful solutions to this.
I guess maybe just to challenge you a little bit, not on the final point, but I think you were talking about renewable energy, and I think one of the biggest challenges I still find make more progress is to actually think about everything as a system which works together. Where the material is going to come from for renewable energy. We know there's critical raw materials. We have a massive shortage for the electrification, for wind turbines, for all these different things. And now we're starting to look at the deep sea. Out of all places, deep sea mining is a completely controversial topic. There's a couple of panels I think happening this week, and I'm really glad that it's kind of coming. I started working on that sort of in a former career, and sort of was quite happy that I stopped working on it because it was so controversial. And then, it's sort of really bubbling up now. And I really, all the conversation about agriculture, carbon, we think about these systems as nature over here, climate over here, equity over here, and not of the whole together. And that's probably where I think we're not making enough progress. We have a climate COP, we have a biodiversity COP. Why? I mean, I know why, but why is it sort of so separated? Why are the conversations being had, in sort of these silos, and why do we continue to not realize the trade-offs we're making as we're trying to make progress? So for me, yes, we are making progress, but that's sort of one of the mindset shifts that still really needs to happen.
So true. So the solutions are there, so we just lack the visibility, lack the resources. So in that context, how can we, different sectors, public sector, private sector, civil society, how can the different sector collaborate in order to, scale up the solution, in order to, to reach the point that, actually, accelerate our action in order to achieve net zero? Felipe?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think the most effective way is like building collaboration and being part of like coalitions, consortiums, and alliances that it's connecting different organizations towards the same end goal. We see like the OP2Bs and Sci platform, and many others like the 4P 1000. Which is more for soil health. So you see a lot of these coalitions and alliances that is being built for a certain purpose, but again, they're all divided, into different boxes. And so how can we create a more holistic kind of a coalition that can fit to, multiple kind of co-benefits that for nature and for people. So I think that's something it's lacking because everyone is developing their own methodology and their own MRV way of measuring things. So who is gonna in the end be the one that is validating and making sure we have more transparent and valuable and more ethical way of communicating towards consumers. So I think in the end I think we have the role to really play along with other organizations and build collaboration. And I'm talking about radical collaboration here. Not just having a few partners, but radical collaboration to really embrace partnerships for making the goals achievable, and from all sectors. So I think that we need to look at holistic kind of approach towards this change, this challenges we have ahead, but really like connecting on a different level, and beyond that, but having like physical connection to the cause you're fighting for as well. So bringing people, if you're working, you know, in agriculture, for example, or whatever field, you know, go to the field and see with your own eyes what you're, you know, what you're embracing and supporting, because it's so amazing, so incredible to see a farm and a farmer that is growing your own food, you know. So be connected to your cause and collaborate radically. I think these are ways we can, yeah.
I really like that sort of radical collaboration aspect. And I attended the opening of the Nature Pavilion earlier this week, and at the end of sort of the you know, sort of, yeah, the discussions and everything, they asked us all to write on a postcard what we sort of commit to do ourselves during COP. And I wrote on my postcard, seek or cross-fertilize and seek collaboration opportunities. And, you know, it kind of comes back to what I was saying earlier. What can you do? You know, it starts with us. We are all humans. And yet, you know, I think it's really important to have radical collaboration. But how do you ensure there's not just another consortium, another coalition, another commitment, another roadmap? You really need to think about sort of the role that you can play from moving from talking about it to action. So that's the sort of, for me, that radical collaboration point I think is really, really important. But I would play it back and say it starts with us. What can we personally do? And that's why, you know, I mean, I work in climate, in inverted commas, right? I mean, I said you know, we shouldn't kind of silo out the things, but I work in climate. And that's why, you know, for example, for me personally, I decided to try to attend some of the nature events. So I also sort of build my knowledge more and understand how things come together. And I think that, you know, that probably is my sort of one thing to say is think about what you can do and how you can bring what you're doing to the table and how you can make it really tangible.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. I think how you approach collaboration depends on where you are in your journey. Right? Like if you're just starting out, you're on a learning journey. Learn by going and finding someone within your sector who you see as a leader, who's doing really good stuff, and learn from them. Don't reinvent the wheel. Find someone who's doing what you should be doing better than you're doing it and see how you can learn from them. If you're further along your journey, then start to share your knowledge. You know, for crying out loud, don't let other people reinvent the wheel. If you understand what has worked and critically what hasn't worked. You know, we talk a lot about greenwashing, but there's also green hushing, which is people not sharing what they've learned because they're afraid of getting repercussions from that. If something didn't work for you, for crying out loud, tell people, like, oh, we tried this and it didn't work. It didn't have the effect we thought it would. Great. That's a learning. Don't let anyone else make that mistake. So collaboration is you know, keep learning what you're doing. Absolutely focus on what can I do? What can you influence? What's within your sphere of influence to have an impact upon? Do everything that you can, and then as soon as you are on that journey, share what you're doing with others so that they can learn from you and shortcut them down the path.
Okay, so I was gonna ask regarding what are your, you know, recommendations for young people to be involved. So, so young people play a very important role in order to achieve net zero. At the COP, we have the first ever Children and Youth Pavilion. There are many side events happening, many young people showcasing their solutions, and you know that's very, very important, very key to involve young people. So, I want to ask, what is your recommendation, you know, for young people, your vision for young people, in order to, you know, to keep pushing, in order for us to achieve net zero? Felipe?
Yeah, I'm gonna give the example of Brazil because we have two different pavilions in Brazil at COP. One is the government, the existing government, Bolsonaro government, and then the other one is the action zone with more indigenous leaders, the young people, and the really, you know, going towards more environmental actions. And you see the big difference when you're present there, you know? Like I think the young energy and the youth has a huge contribution for us to change things. And one side is screaming Lula, the other side, you know, is screaming Bolsonaro. And you see the difference on what kind of commitments they both have towards like environment and our future. So I think the young people has a huge contribution for us to tackle our issues, and my biggest recommendation would be to be part of this decision making. You know, like there's indigenous leaders, young people in the Brazilian pavilion that is representing us in Brazilian elections. You know, they have won the Brazilian elections. So now they are part of this decision making. So I think young people needs to have the courage and embrace the challenge for having their voice heard, for building a new future from all levels. I think we're all part of the solution. So yeah, that will be my contribution.
Love that. I would say sort of my number one piece of advice is to look after yourself first and foremost. It's kind of like if you're on a plane, the recommendation is always put the mask on yourself first and then look after the person next to you after that, right? And look after yourself in your mental health, look after yourself and your physical health, look after yourself in your learning and your education. You cannot give from an empty cup. And you focus on creating the right habits, the right routines, the right behaviors for yourself that will allow you to operate at your full potential. Because if you exhaust yourself and you stress yourself to the max, then you will break. We can only take so much as people and as human beings, and form coalitions with other people, ally yourself with people who share your values, who share your hopes, your dreams, your aspirations, and your fears. And lean on that support network and look after yourself, because this is a marathon, not a sprint. But we are starting to have to run very fast, and a lot of pressure is starting to be placed upon young people being the solution to this. Now, I spend most of my time fighting that and saying, no, don't leave it to us. We'll get there, but at the moment, we are not the ones in charge. But the fact remains that we are going to pick up the mantle on this, and we might not like what we've been left with to solve. And so we need to be in a really good place mentally, physically, spiritually, ourselves, so that we have the fortitude to take that on.
I think well, everything you guys said was, I completely agree with, and we kind of touched upon some of the things earlier in the discussion around, kind of finding where you can apply yourself best, understanding how you sort of fit in the system. I think what you were just saying, young people are sort of tomorrow's leaders, and so it's really important to know that as you kind of come through the system, make sure you equip yourself and understand where you can make that change. I think it's really important to, in the context of that, to not despair at the sort of lack of pace, but sort of to remain hope, and also to remain, or to keep that anger, and to keep that, that questioning that we were talking about earlier, sort of to hold everyone else accountable. But at the end of the day, and I like what you were saying about the sort of, in inverted commas, older generation being responsible for sort of making the situation better. What we don't realize, I think, often is that they are also they were brought up in a very different environment with very different focus, with a very different focus, with a very different. They learned a very very different way of managing organizations, of decision making, of engagement, and so in a way, it's also, I think, young people's privilege to be able to teach them better, and to be able to tell them, and show them the way. It's not putting the responsibility on young people, but I think it's an opportunity to say, hold on a minute, the way that you're doing it, you're not going to solve the challenge, because this is a challenge that none of the old way of thinking would ever be able to solve. So switch off your mind, the mindset shift you were talking about, I think that's going to be really important, and young people have a key role to play, especially from those areas which are affected by climate change, the sort of where they're on the ground, and the agricultural, really the realities of life. I think from every wakes of life, it's really important to make that voice heard, to actually instill that mindset shift.
Thank you. So a small recap. So we have there is many solutions, many technologies. There is lack of resources. There is lack of support. So everything is the puzzles, right? If we bring together all the puzzle, we make strong collaboration, radical collaboration. Then it's feasible in order to achieve net zero by the year 2050. So thank you everyone for being here. Thank you for the speakers. Hoping that everyone here within your sector, makes your small and change within your organization in order to be part of the change. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.